Serious. What are some cryptid, ghost, unexplained stories you'd be willing to share? Story 1. I have a few to share. When I was a baby, I had a bunch of stuffed animals in a net in a wall corner in my room, visible from my crib. One night after I had been put to bed, my mom and grandma heard me giggling on the baby monitor while they were sitting together in the kitchen. They went up to check as that was odd. I should have been asleep by then. Upon entering my room, they found all of my stuffed animals neatly lined up in front of my crib, with the net still intact. At the time, my mom, grandma, and I were the only ones home. Another story I remember is when my mom was driving in a country-ish back road that had houses on it. As she was driving, she saw a house engulfed in flames. She called 911 to report it, though she later found out, I don't remember how, there was nothing wrong with the house at that time. Less than a week later, the house actually caught fire. And no, my mom didn't do it. Once back in the 90s, my dad's car broke down in the middle of the night. He was alone in a quiet back road with not much going on, and luckily, he broke down near a house. It looked a bit dilapidated, but whatever. He needed to call someone to pick him up. He walked over, knocked on the door, and an elderly lady answered. She was sweet, and she let him use the phone to call his dad. He got picked up, and the next morning they came back to tow the car. There's no house anymore, or any side of it. As a child, I had an imaginary friend named DC. I can picture in my head, now as an adult, what he looked like. He was a boy covered in soot. I was attached to him and kind of weird about it. My mom would call me to dinner, and I'd say something like, "DC says I'm not allowed to eat now." My parents could also hear me playing with and talking to him, completely acting as if he were responding to me. A bit of time passed and I stopped mentioning him or playing with him. When my parents asked what happened, I told them he passed away in a fire. A couple of years back, I had a snow globe in my room. It was on a bookshelf across from my bed. I was lying in bed one night trying to fall asleep when I heard the snow globe winding itself up. I opened my eyes and looked in that direction, but saw nothing and assumed I had started to fall asleep and maybe it was a dream. As soon as I laid my head back down and closed my eyes, the snow globe started winding itself up again. For longer this time. I immediately got up and took the snow globe down to the basement. Years ago, my dad used a Ouija board alone. He placed his hands on the planchette and asked a question, and it started to move. The planchette moved more and more aggressively, and my dad decided to stop and take his hands off. The planchette then went in fast figure eights around the board, eventually flying off. My mom also used a Ouija board with some friends years ago, without my dad, and when they were done, they placed the Ouija board on a dresser. Not long after, the board flew off and hit a wall. I've seen shadows out of the corner of my eye, smelled a perfume that my deceased great-grandmother used to wear, seen drinking glass move, had items mysteriously disappear then reappear days later in the spot I had last left them, heard people walking downstairs when I know everyone is in their bedroom upstairs, and I've woken up twice now in the middle of the night to people in my bedroom. This last one, I'm willing to admit, may be explained away as dreaming while half awake. I do not doubt that, in some form or another, ghosts are real. This dude seems to attract otherworldly stuff. I would definitely want to be friends with him. Story 2. One night, I was watching The Conjuring at home with my little sister when we heard someone putting a key into our front door and opening it. We were sitting in the living room next to a sliding door that was very close to the front door, so we both heard it very clearly. Now, this didn't alarm us since we knew our dad had recently gone out to get some stuff, so we just assumed he had returned. "Dad, are you back already?" I casually asked. There was no response. "Dad?" I asked again, thinking that he had not heard me the first time. Again, silence. At that point, I got the feeling that something wasn't quite right, and I could tell by the look on my sister's face that she was quite nervous as well. We'll note that up to this point, she had spent the evening rolling her eyes at horror movie cliches, and she very rarely gets scared. We looked at each other for a moment, wondering what we should do before we started hearing a few more scattering sounds from right outside the sliding door. I was frozen in fear by this stage. I tried one more time in a louder but shakier voice. "Dad? Is that you?" Please respond, I repeated in my head, but the silence continued. Now at this point, I'm freaking out, and I literally jumped off the couch. My sister also abruptly got up and started rapidly walking towards the other end of the room, which leads to the kitchen area. She later revealed to me that she was planning on grabbing a knife. She had this horrified look on her face that I hadn't seen before. We looked at each other in nervous silence. I didn't really know what to do, and I didn't want to make any further sounds. I finally decided to walk up to the sliding door and began opening it as slowly as possible, peering into the darkness. I know. I literally became the idiot who investigates the unknown creepy noise without anything to protect myself with. When the door was finally opened wide enough, I poked my head out and scanned the corridor, preparing for the worst. To my surprise, there was no one there. But what was more strange was that the front door was still completely shut. We never heard the door close. My sister and I were obviously both extremely relieved, as we were almost certain that there was an intruder in the house. After this, I immediately went to ask my mom, who was situated in her bedroom at the other end of her house, if it was her or whether she had noticed anything. She told me that she thought my dad had come home because she also heard someone opening the front door. Around half an hour later, which felt like an eternity at the time, as we were still quite shaken from the incident, my dad finally arrived home and confirmed that he had not come home earlier. To this day, my sister and I still have no idea what happened that night. Story 3. My grandma was traveling with my mom and her 3 younger siblings. One of them was a baby, and the others were toddlers or just young kids. Handling 3 hyper kids and 1 baby on an airplane wasn't much fun. My grandma was beyond exhausted by the time they took their seats. Opting for a back row on the flight, my grandma sat with the 2 youngest, while my mom occupied another row with her sister. Things quieted down a bit when they took off, but as time passed, my mom and her siblings grew more restless. There was a lot of whining, complaining, and crying that made my grandma wish she could just sleep and forget it all. Just as my grandma was about to lose it, a man sitting behind her tapped her shoulder. She turned to look at him and he frowned, noticing how tired she was. He asked if she'd like help calming down her crazy kids. Exhausted, my grandma quickly agreed. Side note, nowadays I don't think people would be so quick to hand over their babies, but this was back when strangers were a lot more chill with each other, so I guess that explains that. My grandma quietly read, a wave of relief washing over her as the man handed my mom and her sisters coloring books and quieted down the baby by dangling an interesting toy over the seat. For the rest of the plane ride, everything was quiet. My grandma says it was the most quiet she'd ever had since my mom was born. The plane landed, my grandma thanked the man and started getting my mom and her siblings ready to get off the plane. She was excited to introduce the man she befriended in the flight to my grandpa and tell him how he saved her from a hell of a flight. My grandma got off the plane with everyone and met up with my grandpa. She proceeded to excitedly tell him all the details and that he should wait with him to meet the man. After all, the man was behind them and would be one of the last ones to get off the plane. They were both in the back rows. 10 minutes went by, then 15. They'd been watching people get off the whole time, but the man never showed up. My grandma was incredibly puzzled by this. How could he have possibly disappeared when they were sitting in front of him and had gone off the plane before him? Worried that something had happened to him, my grandma stopped one of the crew members who had a list of all the people on the flight. She asked for his name, which she had learned on the flight, only to be given this response. "Sorry, ma'am, there's no man's name on this list." To this day, no one quite knows for sure who this man really was or where he could have gone. My grandma and I think it was some sort of guardian angel or spirit sent to help her in a time of need. Story 4. One afternoon I was at work. I walked past a room with a window in the door and automatically glanced in the window. A woman was standing in the room, except that there were only 3 people in the building, and the other 2 were in the office behind me. I took a couple of steps, realized what I had just seen, and backed up quickly, but by the time I got back to the window, the room was empty. There was only one door, and when I opened it, the room was empty. At the same building, a coworker was telling me that she was in the office right around the corner from that same room. She couldn't see the door, but she could see the shadow of the door on the floor as it slowly opened and closed. She was the only one in the building at the time, and she refused to check. I arrived about an hour later and she asked me to check the door, and it was still locked. I worked there for about 3 years, and every single one of us had stories. We heard voices in empty rooms. Once we were sitting in the office and we heard somebody breathing in an empty corner. It was common to be in one of the rooms and think somebody had just walked into the room, only to look up and find that the room was empty except for you. One of the managers scoffed at all of our stories. She did not believe us when we told her there was something fairly benign but creepy in the building. We were sitting in the office. She scoffed and loudly said, "If there's anything here, prove it." We all held our breath, kind of nervous, a bit scared, but also curious. And just about the time my manager was getting that look on her face that said, I told you so," something was thrown out in the hallway. It took several minutes to work up the courage before going to check and finding that a book that normally sat in a bookshelf near the front door had somehow gone from that bookshelf around the corner and halfway down the hallway. The manager never talked about it and quit shortly after that. I've since quit also, but the last I heard, they were still hearing voices and seeing shadows in the building. Can you imagine passing away and getting stuck in an office building as the place you get to haunt? Those poor ghosts will be lonely at night when everyone else has gone home. They say ghosts are spirits with unfinished business. No wonder the family in Story 6 received a mysterious call. Story 5. I grew up in an old house, and my family experienced events that were hard to explain. Besides all the usual noises and occasionally hearing your name being spoken, here are the top 2 weirdest things. My brother and I were teens and we were eating dinner in the kitchen. There was a glass of water on the counter. We heard a noise where the glass was and both looked toward it. We swore we saw it move an inch. As we were still looking and discussing it, the glass flew several feet across the counter and smashed onto the floor. Once, when I was in college and home for the holidays, I was in the kitchen getting food prepared. I was home alone at that point, and my brother was due home at any moment. I heard the front door open and close. I called out hello to my brother and heard nothing back. And I saw a shadow pass by the kitchen into the hallway. And I assumed my brother was being rude, so I followed and kept calling hello. I saw the shadow again, turning another corner toward my brother's bedroom. I saw my brother's door closing. At this point, I was calling out what a jerk he was because we hadn't seen each other in months. I pushed the bedroom door open and uttered some insults, and the room, as well as the whole house, was empty. That was super chilling. I really had seen someone moving through the house. Flash forward 15 years later, and when my husband and I bought an oldish house, built in 1870, I was up on the third floor arranging boxes, and I heard a very clear and very polite woman's voice say,
"Well, hello there."
I've never seen or heard anything in this house since. Story 6. When I was a kid, my grandma was in the hospital during her last days. At the time, my family was strapped for cash and my mom was pregnant, so only my dad went to California, where she lived, to see her before she passed on. The day that she passed, we got a phone call from her, with her wanting to talk to each of us and say how much she loved us. A few hours later, we got a call from family numbers saying that she had passed away. When we told them that we had just received a call from her a few hours prior, everybody was in disbelief, saying that she had been lying unconscious in the hospital bed all day and that she could have never called, let alone been able to articulate her thoughts to us. To this day, we have no idea how she called us, and I don't think we ever will. Story 7. About 6 or so years ago, weird stuff started happening in my mother's apartment. I lived there alone. She lived with her boyfriend but kept the apartment anyway. The door to my bedroom would open or close on its own. At some point in the night, it would close or open at random intervals, with the door handle moving and all that, and not slowly. Sometimes it would full-on slam shut or open. I tried everything, closing all the windows to see if maybe it was the wind. Nope. I checked if there was anyone in the room, but I never found anybody. Hell, it even happened more than a few times in front of a friend. The friend in question also told me my lamp started to switch on and off when I was sleeping. Not like in the movies when the lamp malfunctions. She said it was like it was turning on, then off, then on, etc. Towards the end of this, the sofa that was right beside the door moved by itself when I was on it, in the middle of the night, while I was on Skype on camera. Also, I kept having sleep paralysis with visual and auditory hallucinations at the time. I honestly could have thought I was simply going crazy, but I had eyewitnesses. I never understood what happened that week. It never happened again. Is it just me, or seeing a door open with a handle moving and nobody behind it is 100% reason to leave and never go back? What reason can make this girl stay? Have you ever felt the chill of what hides in the shadows of the night? Or are you curious to discover the mysteries? If you dare, give this video a like and subscribe to my channel to keep watching my terrifying tales in the dark. Story 8. It was a rainy winter morning. My father and I pulled out of the driveway and headed to school. We both saw a glimpse of a girl in a white dress, barefoot and blonde, running around the corner of our home and out of sight. We both looked at each other and acknowledged that we had witnessed the same thing. He got out of the car and ran around the house to look for her. When he came back, he said he couldn't find anyone, but called my mom to let her know that a little kid might be running around the yard. We thought it was weird, but not much was said about it. There weren't any missing kids in the area. A few months later, we were remodeling our basement and found a photo album hidden behind the drywall. It was full of photos of a little girl with blonde hair and a white dress. The photo album was from 1922. The family that originally lived in the house died of TB. Story 9. I chose a stall next to one that was previously occupied by someone with brown leather shoes. Realizing I had no toilet paper, they asked the guy next to me if he could pass me a few sheets. He moved his foot and handed them over. His hand looked strangely pale blue and felt cold to the touch. I took the tissues, finished up, and left the stall quickly. I was shocked to see that the neighboring stall was empty, with only a pair of brown leather shoes. I swear, I have no explanation. I still think it might have been a prank or something, but I just don't know how. Story time. So I was walking home from college one afternoon. It was about a 2-mile walk between home and college. I'm on the outskirts of the town center, entering a busy neighborhood, and everything seemed normal until I started to get a creepy feeling, like I was being watched or something. So I look around and what do I find? Literally every person is looking at me and watching me as I go past them. Even the people driving were looking at me as they went past. This one guy was turning the corner to come onto the road I was about to cross. He was legit leaning over in his seat, staring at me as he drove around this corner. This happened the entire way home but hasn't occurred since. I was super freaked out. I didn't tell my family or friends because they would think I was crazy. Though I know they weren't staring at him. They were staring at what was following him. Story 11. During my freshman year of college, I stayed in the top floor of my residence hall. Everything was normal until about mid-November when my roommate and I would hear what sounded like someone messing with our doorknob and lock. However, we looked at the peephole and no one was there. It was weird, but we brushed it off. One night while I was alone in my dorm room, studying for finals, the lights flickered. I heard a loud bang down the hall and my roommate's TV turned on by itself. It turns out that a girl who lived in the dorm many years ago ended herself from the top floor. The legend goes that every year, around the anniversary of her passing, she goes around and messes with the residents. It sounds silly, but the experience was crazy. Story 12. At my old middle school, I used to have volleyball practice twice a week in the evenings. My sisters, who were older than me, did the same thing at my age. I vividly recall an incident when I went to return volleyballs upstairs from my coach one night, into her classroom which was 2 stories above the gym. As I made it up the stairs, I saw the door for the class across the hallway start to slowly open, revealing a really bright light and smoke or something slowly drifting out, almost dancing. I booked it downstairs and waited a little bit until my coach could walk up with me. The door was shut as if nothing had happened. About 8 or so years later, I was discussing what I saw with my sister. I was half expecting her to think I was crazy. As I went into detail describing what it looked like, which classroom, at which door, she wasn't responding to me. I looked over at her for the first time in a couple of minutes and she was crying. She told me she saw the exact same thing too, and couldn't go back upstairs alone ever again. She was relieved to finally find out she wasn't making it up in her head or being crazy. We pondered all the possibilities of what it could be. Custodians cleaning with the lights on and maybe smoking, but nope. It was too bright for any normal lights in there and way too dark outside for it to be shining through any window. Plus, the custodians would always clean after school and before our practices. We've heard many other stories from other kids at the school who had after-school activities and would see and hear weird things. It still creeps us both out to this day. Story 13. When I was young, I had a boombox and used to record radio shows and FM stations onto cassette tapes. I would hit record and let it run for 60 minutes while I played with my toys or whatever. One time, while listening back to a show, there was a 20-second interruption in the recording. It sounded demonic, a low, guttural growl, and it scared the heck out of me. I played it for my mom and she made me throw the tape away. I never really thought about it for years until I watched the Michael Keaton movie about ghosts and analog tapes. I don't really know about ghosts and all that, but the house we lived in definitely had a negative energy. I would sleepwalk and have terrible nightmares there. Crazy stuff. I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you made it this far, I'm sure you'll also enjoy. What experiences made you believe in ghosts? Story 5 will terrify you. See you on that video.